Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. Second chapter. There was a vivid memory of once a Jussie Joe said a word that the 24th of August for him is connected with the day of his mother's death, and therefore he would like to pay tribute to the deceased and visit her grave. Little girl perfectly remembered the moment when her own mother gladly responded to the request of a neighbor, and in the morning of that date she woke her daughter as early as possible, so that they could make all the necessary preparations. First they had a quick breakfast, and then they began to dressing. "Listen, Delia," mother said cheerfully, trying on daughter a new sundress in front of the mirror. "This year, for your birthday, Dad and I will prepare an unusual present for you. I'm sure that will appeal to you." "What kind of present, Mommy?" asked the girl, who was already impatient to leave the home. "The one you don't even know about," mysteriously mother smiled and immediately changed the subject. "Look at yourself in the mirror, dearie. Você é incrivelmente, she exclaimed in Portuguese. Delia obediently stared at her reflection. Indeed, the sundress was her face's light, in coffee with pink colors, with short sleeves and embroidery in the form of a rose on the chest. White openwork ribbon encircling the waist gave the whole figure of the baby girl a touching fragility. Delia couldn't take her eyes off the mirror, and a slight blush broke out on her cheeks. Mother, who stood behind her, smiled sweetly. "Here, take it," she suddenly thrust a bunch of forget-me-nots into the girl's hands. "Why?" "I didn't," tearing her eyes away from her reflection, Delia asked in an uncomprehending tone. "Don't argue with me," woman raised an eyebrow. "We are going to the burial grounds, you forgot?" At the word the burial grounds, the girl lost heart for a moment and her face turned slightly pale, but after a second her good mood returned. She remembered that they would not go alone, but accompanied by a Jussie Joe. "What should I do with it, Mommy?" she asked, looking at the bunch of flowers. "You'll have to put them on the grave of Joe's late mom," mother began to explain. "What's that got to do?" her daughter interrupted somewhat harshly. Woman was taken aback for a moment. It seemed that she would never get used to the fact that her daughter, like all children, asks adults tricky questions. However, she immediately pulled herself together and smiled good-naturedly at the baby. "When you lay flowers," she began, "then in the next world, the souls of your grandma and grandpa will be with the soul of Joe's mother for all eternity to protect her and take care of her well-being." Having finished the speech, the mother, without waiting for an answer, put her hand on daughter's shoulder and led her to the exit. Delia obediently walked ahead, trying not to drop the forget-me-nots from the hands. Her mother followed her, adjusting her already perfectly fitted hat as she went. So they reached the home's entrance door, climbed the porch and found themselves on the street. Delia looked back, but Mommy silently pushed her forward. They left the gate and walked along the fence that surrounded their site. When she reached neighbor's wicket, Mother stopped and pressed the bell. At that very moment, the barking of Buffalo, he-dog of a Jussie Joe, reached Delia's ears. Baby girl heard him jumping around the yard and throwing himself at the fence, as if trying to climb over it. She knew well that the dog would not touch her, but she still had some fear of Buffalo, so Delia involuntarily stood behind her mother and, covering her face with a bunch, pulled her little head into her shoulders. Mother, sensing her daughter's fear, soothingly stroked her thick black hair. After a few minutes of waiting, the wicket opened, and ran out into the street with a fussy step the tall and slender young man in a strict black suit, white shirt and jacquard tie. His face had a slightly frightened and even guilty expression, no one could understand why. A Jussie Joe, not hiding her joy, Delia screamed and jumping out from behind her mother. Man glanced at the girl, as if in disbelief, then glanced at her mother, then quickly grabbed the handle of the wicket. Buffalo was already preparing to jump out after his owner. The heavy wooden door slammed shut in front of the dog's nose, and a Jussie Joe, taking the keys from his jacket pocket, began to lock the wicket. Delia silently watched the dexterous movements of the man's somewhat nervous hands. When he finally mastered the lock, the girl suddenly had an unbearable desire for him to take her in his arms, and with the thought of this, she approached him and stretched out her hands, but Joe suddenly drew back from the girl. "Sorry, madam," he called to her mother, "what made you wait?" Delia, frozen in one place with a bouquet of forget-me-nots in her hands, didn't know how should she be. She was somewhat offended by the fact that a Jussie Joe, in relation to her, pretended to be untouchable, as if she were not a person, but some annoying insect. It didn't occur to her that this detachment was due to societal norms that a man should not show interest in little girls, at least in terms of physical contacts. As for simple, oral communication, there was not a single unambiguous answer to this question. Meanwhile, a Jussie Joe put the Wicket's keys in his pocket and, turning to the mother and daughter, nodded amiably to them, as if he had just remembered their existence. Delia did not return his greeting, but her mother laughed and offered her hand to the neighbor. Baby girl was a little touched by the way a Jussie Joe cordially greeted her mommy, but she never knew if it was just politeness or something else. In any case, she had no reason to be offended, because it was her own fault that she rushed headlong to meet him. For a second she thought of her dad, who, if he happened to be a witness to this spectacle, would certainly have attacked a Jussie Joe with his fists. A chill ran down her back, but Delia was immediately ashamed of her thoughts, considering them bad omens. In addition, she, being the faithful descendant of her family, never allowed herself, at least she tried, to think badly about her father. Delia believed that Daddy would never fight over trifles, especially with his neighbor. After shaking hands, the adults headed down the road to the burial grounds. Delia, slightly offended by the fact that no one paid any attention to her, tightened her grip on the bunch of forget-me-nots in her hand and followed them. A Jussie Joe walked slowly, shifting his legs gracefully and hardly looking around, which is why his whole appearance seemed to tell those around him that he was in sorrow and that the fun of worldly fuss did not extend to him. Delia's mother, on the other hand, moved quickly and energetically, gesticulating vividly and slightly swaying her rounded hips, hidden under the black fabric of a silk dress. She did not seem to feel any remorse for her frivolous behavior, inappropriate at such a solemn hour. It seemed that the fact that they were on their way to the last asylum for the dead was just an occasion for a heart-to-heart conversation for her. The subject of conversation between adults was, as it was not difficult to guess, the person of a Jussie Joe himself. All the way, Mom constantly turned to him with some thoughtless questions, to which the man answered with great willingness. The sound of his voice gave Delia an unexpected warm feeling towards him. There was something about him that no other man she knew had, neither her old father, whom she had known since childhood, nor any of his acquaintances. Maybe it was a Jussie Joe's touching feigned impotence, or maybe it was his boyish shyness. From his appearance it was possible to conclude that he seemed to be embarrassed to reveal his true self in front of those around him. A Jussie Joe talked to her mother on topics that were boring for little Delia, but nevertheless she listened to him with interest, although she did not understand their meaning. "Why did you choose such an unprestigious profession?" the woman asked him almost playfully. "After the death of my mother," the man answered with some sadness, "I needed to pay off her debts. I had to sell almost all of her things, and this was the only income at that evil days." He sighed. When looking at his face, it became clear that for him it was really the hardest times. "You did not answer me," the girl's mother said impatiently, walking quickly beside him. "Sorry," he answered softly, stammering. "I don't really want to talk about this topic." "To me you can open your whole soul as it is," his interlocutor answered with a smile. "Well," a Jussie Joe's face seemed to light up. "The fact is that I am a professional procrastinator, in other words, and very lazy person." Delia couldn't help but chuckle as she followed her adult companions. Perhaps it was bad manners, but she just couldn't help laughing. The word lazy was too much to match with a Jussie Joe's personality, with his knowledge and manners. Hearing her chuckle, the adults stopped and looked around. The mother carefully looked at her daughter. In her eyes there was bewilderment, mixed with not yet obvious, but still anger. Her daughter felt uncomfortable and smiled guiltily. "Dearie," Mother said sternly. "You can't laugh at other people's shortcomings, everyone has them. And, of course, you have no less of them than anyone else. Delia lowered her eyes. Jussie Joe realized that something had to be done to ease the awkwardness. He gave the girl a friendly wink and turned to her mother. "It's okay, madam," he said in a conciliatory tone. "Do not reproach the child for the fact that adult conversations are funny to him. You yourself, probably, behaved in the same way in your youth. It will pass with age." This speech by Jussie Joe had its effect on Delia's mother, who, after a few moments of hesitation, nodded her head emphatically. "Well, Mr. Thurlow," she said. "Let it be your way." The girl saw how difficult it really was for her mother to take this step, but she did not begin to feel compassion for her. She was much more touched by Jussie Joe's willingness to do something for her, the little and trusting daughter of a pharmaceutist. On her face, in addition to reciprocal gratitude, a gentle smile appeared, and she looked at the man with her large innocent eyes. Jussie Joe didn't seem to notice. He just turned and continued on his way to the burial grounds. "All my adult life I tried to delay the moment," he continued the dialogue, "when I have to start working for a living. When I was younger, I lamented that society was not able to easily give benefits to everyone and everyone." At these words, he sighed. "But, as you understand, the cornucopia is just a utopian symbol, and therefore, with a heavy heart, I had to agree with the foundations of our imperfect world." "Curious," Delia's mother said thoughtfully. "So are you satisfied with your profession? I know she don't make a lot of money." "It's not so much about the money," said Jussie Joe. "I went down the path of a culturologist solely because, so as not to spend a lot of time at work." "You want to say that even this job exhausts all your strength?" His interlocutor frowned. "I believe that a person should not live only by labor. I hated the idea of becoming some kind of sales clerk or steward, because others will treat you not as an individual, but only as a screw in a social structure. Such work deprives me of the possibility of self-expression, and my nature does not accept this." "I would not say that I am satisfied with your outlook on life," woman said with hidden contempt. "I wonder how your late mother felt about this." "She wasn't happy with it either," bowed his head Jussie Joe. "She constantly lamented, seeing how I wasted her money to no purpose. I understood how hard it was for her, because she had to earn a living and my upbringing alone." "Did you consider yourself not a good son?" Delia's mother interrupted him unexpectedly. "Hard to give answer," man shrugged. "I never claimed to be an outstanding person. Parents tend to idealize their children, but the child wants to be himself first and foremost, and I was no exception." "Oh, those children," thoughtfully said his interlocutor. After these words, Delia's mother gave her daughter a look of regret and pity for a moment. Meanwhile, this trinity had already approached the burial grounds. It was cool under the arches of tall trees that grew near the iron fence, which had darkened with time. Sunlight played on the leaves of old oaks and maples. Every now and then, bird trills were heard to baby girls' ears, accompanied by a quiet rustle of leaves. The adults passed through the gate and went along a path that ran between even rows of graves and led out to a small area where the roof of a small crypt, surrounded by flowering lilac bushes, shone brightly under the rays of the sun. On its left side stood a tall obelisk of black granite, which stood on a low white pedestal, which made its whole appearance look rather contrasting. In the rays of the morning sun, its shiny surface shone with an incredible brilliance. Delia, following her companions, looked around with interest. At first she was struck by the harsh beauty of the tombstones, but soon curiosity gave way to another feeling close to melancholy. Undoubtedly, the sight of the tombstones evoked in the girl's soul a strange feeling of false loss. It seemed to her that as soon as she crossed the invisible border that separated the rest of the world from the burial grounds, she immediately felt sorry for everyone and everyone who was buried under heavy granite slabs. Perhaps it just could be a childish reverence for the last refuge of the dead, but one way or another, kids feel the world around them more keenly than adults, so it was impossible to explain in simple words the strange feelings that gripped Delia at that moment, if only because she herself could not express. Meanwhile, a procession of 2 adults and 1 child approached the desired grave, the stone slab of which was hidden under thickets of weeds, it is obvious that no one cared about the mother of some lorn culturologist. In the midst of them, a simple tombstone made of natural stone with the inscription Jordan Thurlow, July 21, 1946 to August 24, 1984, carved on it, against the background of neighboring, neatly cleaned graves, made such a depressing impression that it seemed as if a not poor, humble woman was buried here. A woman, but a vile criminal who was disgusting even in death. "My lord," exclaimed Delia's mother, spreading her arms. "What's been going on?" Rousing himself from his stupor, Adjusty Joe asked. "You didn't follow her grave at all," the woman answered reproachfully. "When was the last time you went here?" The last words she said, already turned to the man. Delia saw her mother's face glow with such energy, such determination that it was clear, this woman is ready for anything, no matter what the cost. The girl turned her gaze to Adjusty Joe, who stood silently, looking ahead of him. His shoulders were relaxed and slumped, as if he was instantly weary of what was happening. After a moment's pause, Delia's mother suddenly rushed to the grave of Jordan Thurlow and, grabbing a green weed, pulled it with force. There was a crunch, and clods of earth flew in all directions. Baby girl jumped aside in time, and her sundress remained clean. Her mother continued to vigorously uproot the weeds, while Adjusty Joe continued to stand in a relaxed posture and watched in bewilderment. Delia looked sideways at him. She was somewhat embarrassed that the man did not even try to help the woman, to his neighbor and her mother rolled into one. "Adjusty Joe," suddenly she said, standing on tiptoe to look into his face. "Help my mom, please." "Strong you are, I know." Her last words made Adjusty Joe smile. Apparently, it was funny for a grown man to hear a little girl trying to appeal to his strength. Tilting his head slightly to one side, causing his hair to be a little disheveled, he looked down at the girl, and his smile seemed slightly smug. "You got that right, dearie," mother's voice rang out. Joe and Delia turned to her at the same time. She stood by the grave, her face flushed with work-expressed mild displeasure. The girl noticed that her mother's black silk dress now had ugly stains from damp earth. "Mommy, you're all messy," Delia exclaimed with some dismay. The mother did not answer her daughter, only looked herself up and down, as if surprised at how she managed to get dirty. It just so happened that she was so passionate about her work that she didn't pay attention to her appearance at all. The girl turned her gaze to Uncle Joe, who was already rolling up his sleeves, about to take part in cleaning the grave. "Are not you ashamed, Mr. Thurlow?" said the woman, straightening her back. "You make me clean up your mother's grave alone, until yourself." Then she bit her tongue, realizing, apparently, that it was very risky to talk in such a tone with her little daughter. What if the child picks up rude words and uses them in a conversation with everyone he meets? Meanwhile, Adjusty Joe approached the grave with a firm and measured step, unbuttoning his jacket as he went. At the same time, he looked like he was forcibly forced to take up the case. He bent down and began pulling weeds with his bare hands, then his partner followed suit. Delia, with barely concealed pleasure, watched how the adults worked harmoniously and energetically. Male help was very rich indeed. In a few minutes, the eyes of all those present began to open up a view of a neat granite slab inlaid with a vine. It turns out that in 5 years the wind and rains almost did not touch the surface of the stone, except that the dirt slightly stained the exquisite patterns. As soon as all the weeds were pulled out by the joint efforts of Joe and Delia's mother, the girl went to the grave and, bending her knees, began to examine with interest the design made in granite. Pushing a strand of hair out of her forehead, Delia reached forward with her left hand and gently ran the tip of her index finger over the polished stone. Still clutching the bouquet of forget-me-nots she continued to hold in other hand. She heard Adjusty Joe's soft sigh and turned her head slightly to look at him. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and silently looked at the grave. His sad eyes and lowered hands touched baby girl's heart for some reason, and she wanted to say something encouraging to him. But as soon as she began to look for words, the thought suddenly came into her head that it was not worth talking a lot at the grave of the deceased. So Delia contented herself with an innocent shrug and a sweet smile. Solemn Trinity continued to silently look at Jordan Thurlow's grave, occasionally exchanging glances. Then Delia's mother sighed and, raising her right hand to her face, began to massage the bridge of her nose, and her eyes, as it seemed to the girl, were moistened with tears. Adjusty Joe smiled sheepishly. It was some time before the silence was broken by the mother's voice. "Delia, do you think Jordan's mom would love to meet you if she were alive?" In a fit of sentimentality, woman asked a rhetorical question. In the next second, she let her tears flow, and her weeping echoed through the burial grounds. Taken aback, her daughter trembled all over, feeling like she was about to cry too. Resting her feet firmly on the ground, she pressed the bouquet to her chest and froze. Sad thoughts slowly began to enter her mind about how difficult it would be for her if her own parents were gone. As she knew, human age is short, plus everything a person can be suddenly mortal, and, being just a small child, she was terrified of losing her parents, especially Mom. As for her dad, it seemed to Delia, with her little life experience, that with his death, little would change in her life, except that dust would settle in his place in the dining room, and because of the closed doors of their living room, the echoes of his heated arguments with her mother would cease to be heard regarding pedagogical and religious views on daughter's upbringing. Her mother's call snapped her out of these thoughts. Delia looked up and saw that she had already moved away from the grave and was now standing with Uncle Joe on the cobbled path between the burials. When her daughter looked back, the woman waved her hand in the direction of the tombstone. "Delia," she repeated, looking attentively at baby girl, "put forget-me-nots at the head and come to us, it's time to go home." Recovering herself, the girl gave her mother a nod and, rising to her feet, went to the very edge of the grave and, slightly turning the bunch of forget-me-nots in her hands, she really liked these flowers, slowly lowered it onto soft soil, and then taken notice to the adults and looked at them questioningly. "Right," Mother nodded with a smile on her lips. "And now come to us." "Hurry up," she hurried her daughter, who hesitated indecisively on the spot. Adjusty Joe, standing a little behind Delia's mother, silently watched everything that was happening. The sad expression disappeared from his face, and now he seemed happy and peaceful, and the clods of dirt on his strict suit gave his appearance a carelessness and some frivolity. Delia felt something stir in her soul as she looked at him, but she couldn't figure out what the feeling was. She went to meet the adults, having managed to wipe her hands on her sundress along the way. This action did not escape the eyes of the mother, who frowned and shook her head reproachfully. "Dearie, why did you get your clothes dirty?" the woman asked as Delia walked over and stood next to her. "You're not some simpleton, you're a civilized lady." Taking the girl by the hand, the mother gently squeezed her small hand in hers and led her towards the exit from the burial grounds. Delia obediently followed her, feeling a little uneasy at being so unceremoniously torn away from her sincere expression of feelings in front of Jordan Thurlow's grave. Apparently, this feeling was transmitted to her mother, who quickened her pace, so that her daughter had to hurry after her. Soon the feeling of some stiffness passed, and Delia returned to her thoughts. She believed that the bouquet of forget-me-nots, which she happened to lay today, would lie on the grave for eternity, reminding everyone around how a well-bred young lady paid tribute to the memory of the deceased mother of her spiritual teacher and mentor, thereby expressing her deepest respect to himself and to all his family. As befits a good little girl, Delia continued to walk beside her mother, but as their procession passed the cemetery fence, she couldn't help but look back and take one last look at grave of Adjusty Joe's mother. What was revealed to the eyes of a little girl shocked her to the core. At the tombstone stood an unfamiliar man in torn clothes, unshaven and with dirty tousled hair sticking out from under his old felt hat. For a few moments it seemed to her that it was some kind of ghost wandering between the graves, but when she looked closer, she realized that it was the most ordinary olden pauper, in appearance very similar to those whom she used to see on the television screen in dull and boring television movies on the urban theme. Looking furtively around, the man took off his hat and immediately picked up a bunch of forget-me-nots from the ground. It took a lot of effort for Delia to cover her mouth with her hand so as not to scream from the feelings of resentment and childish indignation that captured her. With a whistling exhalation of air, Olden Popper, trying as discreetly as possible to put the flowers in the pocket of his bottomless pockets, rushed away. Baby girl followed the man with her eyes until he disappeared behind the building of the crypt. Forcefully clenching her free hand into a fist, Delia gritted her teeth and took a deep breath. Thoughts about the unworthy behavior of Olden Popper did not leave her mind. She asked herself questions from the category: why did he steal the flowers, intended for the deceased, what was he going to do with them, and so on. For a split second, Delia was seized with a desire to immediately punish the pickfloret, but she suppressed this desire, realizing that there was nothing she could do, and even if she tried, it would look at least stupid, if not risky. Sighing, the girl turned her gaze to her mother, who continued to lead her forward, following a Jussie Joe. Delia felt how the wind, which until then slightly stirred her hair, gradually intensified and now began to blow under her clothes. She shivered from the cold and raised her hand, which had been stiff from lying for a long time, to straighten her chemise. At that moment, it was out of the question to get up from the windowsill and put on something warmer. The girl was so captivated by the sight of the moon, which in the meantime had already begun to run into dark and vague clouds. Delia was in a state where thoughts dominated the desire of her body, and although by nature she was disposed to melancholic reflections, but in a state of prostration like this, she had bothered to fall for the first time in all her 10 years. Delia remembered one of her many Sunday trips to the local church, which located not too far from her home, if think about it. The church itself was very beautiful, a brick-lined building with additional stonework, the rounded windows of which indicated that the architect was fond of the Romanesque style. The corner tower with battlements, which towered above the roof of the rest of the church, evoked in Delia pleasant associations with movies about medieval life, and, one might say, gave the girl additional motivation to go to this place, not counting her Lutheran confession, of course. On that Sunday, the daughter and mother, according to the tradition established in their family, dressed in lace shawls, Delia in lilac, her mom in black, and leaving the house, they soon reached the front doors of the church. That day, Delia was not in a good mood, because before leaving the house she managed to quarrel with her father because he found fault with her drawing of a man with red hair. The main reason was not in the picture itself, who was rough just like others kids her age, but in the fact that the girl signed it with those 8 cherished letters that caused unjustified panic and paranoia in her parents and a burst of admiration in Delia herself. So when father left home for his job, the girl without much interest went to church, without even talking to your mother on the way. True, she, being a witness to the quarrel between her daughter and her husband, in turn, was also not disposed to conduct sincere conversations with the child. When both women finally made it to the church, a sullen feeling of dissatisfaction gradually gave way to inexplicable excitement, and after a few minutes Delia forgot about her family quarrel. The chain-hung lamps, adorned with beautiful hexagonal shades, glowed with a warm yellow light that reflected off the polished wood of the furniture. The lighting was subdued, as if the church leaders did not want to disturb the solemnity of the moment with the bright light of electric lamps, but this did not prevent the girl from enthusiastically examining the vintage interior of the church, which she had never been particularly interested in before, since church was as much a chore to her as school or the grocery store. It was immediately evident to her that the interior bore the features of the Gothic style, evidence of which was the ceiling support, carved from oak and spruce planks. They contrasted with the white walls, decorated modestly but tastefully. Paying no attention to the parishioners crowding among the semicircular rows of benches, Delia had set their eyes on the altar, making her face take on a dreamy expression, and strands of thick hair lying on the shoulders were a little disheveled, but from the side it was not noticeable due to the shawl thrown over it. Worship in the Portland church differed little from a similar procedure, which she observed while living in New York, except that among the parishioners, the number of old people prevailed over middle-aged people, and of the children at the moment there was only one Delia, as if the locals were of the opinion that you should not take your children to church. The girl did not remember how the divine service went, because in her thoughts she was completely absorbed in Joe. It seemed that the solemn atmosphere of this holy place with renewed vigor resurrected the image of this man in her thoughts. As the congregation began to disperse, the girl's mother gave her a light nudge on the shoulder. "Dearie, we need to go," there was weariness in the woman's voice. Delia, continuing to stand still, only turned her head towards her. "Mommy, I want to stay here," she said humbly. Her mother put her arms around her awkwardly. "What are you lost here?" woman asked in bewilderment. "I will stay," insistently repeated her daughter, turning away from her. "As you wish, beautiful," surrendered mother. With that, she walked out of the church as Delia continued to stare at the carved oak altar. "I will be waiting for you outside," her mother's voice reached baby ears. Convinced that she had left the church, the girl, straightening her shawl, stepped out from behind the rows of wooden benches onto the red carpeted space in front of the altar, at which at that moment the vicar stood alone, who by appearance could have been 40 years old. He was dressed in an impeccable black cassock, and his hair was hidden by a hood of the same color. The clergyman watched the bustling people who left the church, not even trying to hide the boredom on his face. It seemed that he did not attach any importance to the child, who at that time was approaching him. Delia, on the contrary, with every step that brought her closer to the altar, felt more and more excited. Her arms were trembling slightly with excitement, so she had to keep them crossed over her chest. She felt the bewildered glances of other parishioners glide over her body, wrapped in a lilac shawl. Coming closer to the vicar, Delia adjusted her veil slightly so that the clergyman could better see her face, and stopped at the foot of the 4 steps, covered with red velvet carpet. "Good afternoon to you, Reverend Willis," softly but firmly said the girl. At the sound of her voice, the vicar visibly shuddered and, gliding over her with an indifferent look, continued to remain silent. "Allow me to ask you," Delia continued decisively. The clergyman turned to her. From the gleam of his eyes it was clear that he was completely in no mood to chat about trifles with juvenile parishioners, even if they were as serious as this one. "Go with peace, my daughter," he said with displeasure. "Can you please," Delia began, but the vicar interrupted her. "Worship time is over, you have nothing more to do here," and the clergyman pointed to the exit. Such treatment hurt the girl a little, but she did not show it, and only the blush of her cheeks betrayed her annoyance. "I wanted your advice, Reverend Willis," she said firmly, looking into the vicar's face. "What a naughty gal," barely audible he whispered. "Go home, my daughter," said the clergyman, raising his voice. "I'm not going anywhere, until you answer my question," stubbornly girl answered him. Delia couldn't help but lightly stamp her black-shoed foot. This not bad way to express your impatience in the walls of the church looked out of place, but today the girl was determined and therefore allowed herself to break through the rules. In the next second, Vicar surrendered to her pressure and, having taken a couple of steps towards her, stopped on the topmost step. "What's eating you, my daughter?" There was still a note of displeasure in his voice. "Reverend Willis," Delia began, "I dread to think, but sometimes it seems to me that adults are hiding something from me." The girl had in mind, of course, the fact that her parents withhold from her everything connected with a Jussie Joe. But how was this particular church dignitary to know? "Don't worry, my daughter," the vicar answered her. "Parents always do not immediately open the world to their child, for a person must learn it gradually, bit by bit." Delia did not like the way the clergyman, instead of listening to his interlocutor, immediately began to indulge in spatial speeches that did not at all relate to what she wanted to know now. "That's not what I meant, Reverend Willis," trying to keep a calm tone, she said. Alas, Vicar could not be stopped. It seemed that the question of the young parishioner became a catalyst for his eloquence, and the clergyman was unable to suppress the flow of common truths that fell from his lips on the pharmaceutist's daughter, who was little interested in religious conversations. "If a man," said the vicar, raising his finger to the ceiling, "from a young age suddenly learns everything about the world at once, then know, my daughter, that this is from the evil one, and such a person goes against the commandments of the Lord." Delia realized that she would again have to go against the rules of good manners in order to force the clergyman to answer the question that had been troubling her for many months. Taking a deep breath, she almost instinctively put her hands on her gentle hips, as her mother liked to do during family quarrels. Please listen to me, Reverend Willis, Delia said loudly, interrupting the moralizing tirade of the interlocutor. My parents don't want to talk to me about the person I feel this way she broke off in mid-sentence. The girl was embarrassed to talk about a Jussie Joe directly. She was tormented by suspicions. What if she told the vicar about her spiritual connection with a grown man? Then the clergyman will immediately begin to shower her with reproaches, without even trying to find out what exactly their communication consisted of. Therefore, she had to make an effort to shut up and freeze in the pose of an obedient and submissive the servant of the Lord. Noticing this, the vicar did not reprimand her for misbehavior and even showed on his face the semblance of a pious smile, which in a second was replaced by the usual expression of calm. Things can still work out, my daughter, the clergyman consoled Delia. Are you talking about love? There was a hint of mild interest in the vicar's voice, which gave Delia self-confidence. Nodding her head in agreement at his words, she brushed away the unruly curls that were escaping from under her shawl. Reverend Willis, I'm living in constant fear, she spoke cheerfully, that something bad happened to this person. What should I do? After these words, the girl fixed her dark eyes on the vicar. Although her question was not quite correctly worded, the tone in which Delia asked it should have served as evidence that the answer to it is really important to her. Alas, the clergyman did not take the child's words seriously. Instead, he, without spending a second to think, gave her a condescending smile. You love, my daughter, and amour with awe are always alongside, as if reciting some truism, the vicar said good-naturedly. Just have faith, hope and wait. With these words, he turned away from the girl and raised his eyes to hanging over the altar darkened with time-round metal plate, decorated with complex patterns, covered in some places with worn gilding. This was to be taken as a sign that their conversation had come to an end. Delia had no choice but to straighten her shawl and head for the exit. The whole figure of the girl spoke of the fact that this dialogue left her in a state of discontent, and now she struggled hard not to voice her disagreement with the clergyman's answer. Trying to step as slowly as possible on the red carpet spread between the rows of benches, the girl considered to herself that, translated into plain language, the words of the vicar meant that he was unable to give Delia advice on how to deal with her situation with a Jussie Joe. She regretted that she had not spoken directly to the face of the clergyman, a quote from a book that she once read with her adult friend. Although it could be called reading with a big stretch, for the girl just sat there listening to a Jussie Joe read aloud to his young listener. Specifically, the quote that Delia considered appropriate in this situation was that a certain sage and doctor asked Lord God to destroy the human race, so that he would create more perfect people, but Lord God replied that although he sympathized with the sage, he could not fulfill his request. It is possible that in fact the dialogue had a completely different meaning, but the girl could not know this, if only because the contents of this book, a Jussie Joe had to translate right on the go, for it was written in the German, of which Delia's knowledge was very superficial, to say the least. If the girl could find this book in her own language, then she would doubtless have checked with her and told the vicar exactly what was said in the original, but to her greatest regret, she was prevented from finding an English translation of this book as her parents, who seemed to hate everything about a Jussie Joe, and the fact that she could not know the exact name, it was difficult for Delia to remember and pronounce the German words. And approximate translation of is not an easy being. A god would likely do nothing for bored bookstore vendors. Therefore, Delia silently walked to the exit, bowing her head. She didn't quote yet because when a Jussie Joe finished reading this book, he forbade the girl to quote her right and left. As she thought, the point was that the Lord God described on her pages was not a gray-haired old person who sat on a cloud and gave orders to angels, but on the contrary, a brave young knight who rode a horse and participated in the squabbles of some medieval town. What's the harm, Delia thought, presenting Lord God as a tough guy? She remembered how the book described that this Lord God, who, under the guise of a mere mortal, tried to make this world better than it really is, in his travels he fell in love with a woman, but when she was vilely killed, he became furious and made something like Armageddon, only he was wield not some ridiculous fireballs, but a very real knightly sword made of steel, with which he cut his way through the retinue of the treacherous king, and, reaching the last, ended the end of his tyranny. It all ended with the fact that after this event, God himself was taken away by any one of his friends, with whom, walking through the gardens of Eden, he ate strawberries and jokingly frightened those around him with his palms, which were stained with its juice. But since Jesse Joe said that other adults will not appreciate such an interpretation of the Lord God out of the mouths of baby girl, then Delia could only held her tongue and just quietly leave the church, having received from the lips of the vicar an answer that explains nothing how her to deal with the situation, when her parents plotted and kept her friend's true fate from her. The memory of the dialogue with the vicar drove Delia into a state close to despair. She took a deep breath, and, straightening her shoulders stiff from the cold, she ran her hand along the cold surface of the window sill. The moon had long been hidden by clouds, and the dampness of the coming bad weather was felt in the night air. The suspicion crept into the girl's head that it could rain at any moment and she risks getting wet under its jets, but she continued to sit still, throwing a sidelong glance into her room. What if the door opens and her mother or father comes in? But, much to Delia's happiness, none of her parents entered her bedroom. It was to her liking. Now, more than ever, the girl didn't want their presence, for she felt an urgent need to forget them and remember her life up to the today's moment. Calming down, Delia turned her head to the sky and, closing her eyes for a few seconds, tried to put all thoughts of the present out of her mind, so that they do not interfere with focusing on images from the happy moments of her past together with Jesse Joe. She did not risk getting tired of the painstaking sorting out of her reminiscences and fall into the sleep, because the cold wind blowing from the direction of the forest just did not give her such an opportunity. Unlike New York, where Delia had previously lived with her parents, in Portland there was no need to question the existence of nature around, as often happened to the girl on the streets of the metropolis filled with cars, where any blade of grass, timidly growing in the cracks of the asphalt, seemed to be a symbol of the green world and at the same time the personification of wildlife rolled into one. Images from her and Jordan's very last pastime resurfaced in Delia's mind. It could never be called the date, for in the first place, Delia was too young for that, and secondly, if a date is usually a meeting in private, then this event took place in the company of Jordan's close friend, whom the girl respected in absentia, but never seen before. In her own imagination, the world around Delia was come back through time. She herself was not in those events, not in the sense that she was not there physically. On the contrary, Delia was directly involved in those incidents. The thing was that her own visual image was missing in the memories, for such a human has not yet been born who could see himself from the outside, without losing the ability to navigate the world around him and evaluate what is happening from the point of view of the first person. Visit to Jordan's friend was an unexpected surprise for little Delia, which was not included in her plans for the evening of that day. Quite the contrary, by this point she had hinted to Jesse Joe several times that it is time for her to go home to begin her direct duties of preparing for tomorrow's exam in literature, which all her classmates were waiting with such tension, to say nothing of herself. Her house was very close, literally the next wicket to the right, but Delia couldn't shake the feeling that if she left her neighbor without asking, she would spoil his mood, which she really did not want at all. So she tried to get Jordan to let her go instead of leaving his house herself. Jesse Joe, I'm begging you, she moaned. I have an important exam at school, I just don't know how I can pass it. But Jordan, as if nothing had happened, continued to sit in his chair, holding an open book in his hands, which he read with some curiosity. Delia realized that her request would go unanswered and decided to persevere. Taking a few steps toward the armchair, she stepped over Jesse Joe's legs and rested her palms on the green chintz armrests. At that very moment, Jordan slammed the book shut and looked up at her, which passed her attention, because the girl was involuntarily interested in her cover. It was a hardcover pamphlet with the title written in huge white letters on the glossy blue surface. The Book of Light, Delia read with some hesitation, as if tasting the word. She removed her hands from the armrests and looked inquiringly at Jordan, whose face broke into an enigmatic smile. Is that my pronunciation make him amuses, she asked herself, when their eyes met. She felt uncomfortable and looked back at the book. A minute later, Jussie Joe broke the silence. "Oh, that's boring," in an apologetic tone he began. "It's all about healing and crystals." Delia, hearing this definition, barely kept a smile. She always believed that her adult friend was a connoisseur of quality literature, and she was surprised that he allowed himself to read up such a foolish and worthless book. But what to do when there are so many idiots around who are ready to pay for some nonsense that they don't even understand? From these thoughts, the girl suddenly wanted to death to say something bold and mocking in the direction of the pamphlet, which Jordan, meanwhile, had already placed on the table to his right. Delia spread her elbows wide, put her hands on her hips and squared her shoulders to look as pugnacious as possible. "And stupid junk," she said loudly and articulately, imitating the voice of a literary critic who read his devastating review of the book of whatever graphomaniac. In fact, Delia was not sure of the need for such an excess. Usually she never stooped to such feigned pathos, at least in communication with her parents. But now she felt that in this way she could make some impression on Jussie Joe by proving to him how well she understood the modern literary kitchen. And she was not mistaken. Her adult friend looked approvingly at his young friend and nodded his head. "Trust me, I am in total agreement with you," he exclaimed joyfully. "I'm getting sick and tired of this esoteric nonsense. I would never pick up a book like this if on the street I had not been forced to take it by one wacky. By the way, I was wondering," suddenly he changed his tone, "why do you think this book is stupid junk, as you put it?" After asking this question, Jussie Joe stared at Delia intently, and it was clear from his serious face that he was waiting for an answer. The girl felt awkward and all her pugnacious exuberance disappeared somewhere. She blushed and lowered her eyes, but Jordan didn't seem to want to change the subject. He waited for Delia to look up at him again and winked at her. "Tell me why you didn't like this book," he repeated his question. Delia realized that it was pointless to keep silent. Besides, it was necessary to somehow diffuse the tension that had arisen, so she decided to play along with Jussie Joe, and gave him an answer which, she rightly believed, should please him to the core. "I believe," Delia said, raising her eyes to the ceiling for a second, "that a human does not benefit from some sort of a pebbles. Crystals can't help health in any case. It's complete nonsense," she cried out with sudden vehemence. Her sincere and direct answer seemed to delight Jussie Joe either way. He smirked and nodded his approval several times. Delia herself experienced a strange feeling, as if she had just delivered a speech to the public, which met her speech with a standing ovation and applause. She straightened her unruly dark hair, straightened her skirt and tried to put on an indifferent expression on her face, in order to somehow hide the confusion that had seized her, but the blush that appeared on her cheeks testified that she was not good at it. As it were, Jussie Joe got up from his chair. Little girl shuddered and, leaning back, instinctively covered herself with her hand. Jordan went to the table and, picking up this ill-fated book, turned to Delia, who stood in front of the chair as if spellbound, and looked at Jussie through her fingers with some surprise, but without fear. "I want to do something nice for you," he said, opening the pamphlet. "You do love." He suddenly fell silent and began turning the pages randomly. Delia involuntarily wondered what her adult friend had in mind. Baby girl lowered her hand from her face and, narrowing her eyes, carefully looked at his concentrated face. "What I love?" she asked with barely concealed curiosity. "Read? Paint? Incinerate," answered unexpectedly Jussie Joe and violently pulled the book by the edges of the binding. There was the sound of tearing paper, and several book pages flew into the floorboards. The next moment, Jordan began tearing the book to pieces with a vengeance, while Delia silently watched his actions. She could not even think that she could be so delighted with the sight of an adult man, bothering himself with such an atypical activity for his age. Soon a pile of tattered paper pages lay at Jussie Joe's feet, and the hardcover he hadn't been able to tear was thrown to the floor beside them. Joyful man took out a lighter from his pocket and nodded to the girl, who involuntarily felt funny, but she managed to suppress a smile, not wanting to seem impolite. Take these shreds, Adjusty Joe kicked the paper, and take it to the hearth. After these words, he moved to the opposite corner of the room, and Delia, after a little hesitation, squatted down next to what's left of a foolish book and began to carefully pick it up from the floor, piece by piece, folding them into the hem of her light skirt, which she usually wore in autumn, when the weather was still warm enough to walk in easy clothes. When Delia had collected everything, she straightened up and turned to the mantelpiece, where Adjusty Joe was already standing. "Get over here," he beckoned her with a gesture. Holding the hem of her skirt, the girl slowly, so as not to spill the paper, moved towards him. As soon as she was near Jordan, the man bent down and opened the iron door of the fireplace. "Throw all your burden in there," he nodded to her, referring to the book's odds and ends. Delia released her hands from her skirt in relief, and the paper fell with a rustle right into the dark maw of the fireplace. Only the cardboard halves of the binding did not seem to want to agree with this, and with a barely audible thud fell under her feet. Little girl had to bend down and pick them up from the floor, after which she threw him to the rest of the scraps. "You make me proud," exclaimed Adjusty Joe with inappropriate triumph. "Now step aside." Delia obeyed, and her adult friend squatted in front of the fireplace and flicked on his lighter. A few seconds later, a crack was heard right in front of his face, but nothing terrible, of course, happened. It was just a small fire flaring up, and in a few moments the flames were already licking the paper and carton folded in the middle of the fireplace. Adjusty Joe got up, brushed the dust off his knees, and shoving his hands into his trouser pockets stood beside the girl. "The Book of Light, they say," with irony in his voice he muttered softly, looking at the fire. "Let there be light," Delia answered cheerfully, her eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. So Joe and Delia stood for a while, silently watching as the fire turns tabloid esoteric fiction into what it essentially is, to ashes, only not figuratively, but literally. The girl had the feeling that the act of burning they had just committed is a challenge to the whole society of these demented psychics who themselves do not understand the meaning of their pseudoscientific teachings, but with surprising perseverance they try to teach it to others, naively believing, as if an educated person has any business with their ridiculous and senseless fuss with crystals and such nonsense, ostensibly bringing human benefit and purification. Suddenly, Adjusty Joe threw back his head to the ceiling, and the girl heard his laughter, similar to the laughter of a child who received a long-awaited gift. She shuddered in surprise and recoiled from him, but soon she realized what was the matter and laughed with him. Her laughter was full of such unbridled joy and happiness as she had never experienced before. It seemed that her whole being was filled with such bliss and peace that no other event in her life could previously cause, even birthdays, Christmas, or some other family holidays. It was this strange event, burning an unwise pamphlet in a neighbor's fireplace, that could cause her a strong surge of happiness. Soon they calmed down. First Adjusty Joe stopped laughing, and then Delia herself. Man and a little girl stood near the fireplace, where the last pages of a tattered, foolish and useless tiny book were burning down, which both of them, not without reason, considered, if not bad, then at least mind-numbing reading matter. Burning these pages gave them self-confidence, and, one might even say, awakened their taste for life. Adjusty Joe, looking up from the fireplace, turned to the girl and peered at her for a while, apparently trying to understand from the expression on her face what impression their sudden act made on her. Delia, feeling his eyes on her, blushed in embarrassment and began to straighten her slightly wrinkled skirt. "Did you like it?" he asked kindly. In response, the girl nodded her head in the affirmative. "You've never laughed like this before," continued Adjusty Joe. "Agree, because it's great to burn the books?" "If that's a junk fiction, then yes," Delia replied cheerfully, jumping up and down. "I'm not saying that this applies to all literature," as if making excuses, Jordan began to explain. "Those who can really teach something should be cherished as height of luxury, and they should not be burned at all." Delia raised her hand to her face and scratched her chin thoughtfully, which obviously amused her interlocutor, who, in response to her gesture, tilted his head to the side and let out some semblance of a chuckle. This slightly hurt the girl, but she did not show it. Looking at Adjusty Joe, she suddenly realized clearly how much he looked like her. It was not so much about external data, but how much they had similar internal qualities. After all, if dig into the depths of his soul, it turns out that the difference in age, as it were, did not exist. Jesse Joe, at 24, was still as naive and childish as Delia herself. In fact, the only difference between them was only in the level of knowledge and experience. "Hold on a second," suddenly said Jesse Joe, raising his finger to the ceiling. After that, he went to the desk, on which lay some papers, books, and also there was a small telephone set. Delia stared at him in bewilderment, but when the man's hand reached for the telephone receiver, she could not stand it and took a few uncertain steps towards him. "Where are you calling?" she asked with a sudden tremor in her voice. "Take it easy, Delia," said Jesse Joe, looking at her affectionately. "Just give me a minute to talk." With these words, he began to dial the number, and the girl heard a characteristic sound with which the disc of the device rotates. Jesse Joe had a very old model of phone. She realized that Jordan wanted her out of the way, but she asked him one more question just in case. "It have to do with me?" she asked without any hesitation. "I feel like you're reading my mind," Jesse Joe smiled. "Of course it is related. Something very interesting is waiting for you." "Highly," he repeated, and to emphasize the importance of the word, he snapped the fingers of his free hand. Calming down, Delia stood behind him. It suddenly occurred to her some wonderful idea: eavesdrop on someone else's conversation and find out what adults are talking about. A slight smirk appeared on Jesse Joe's lips, and he nodded his head approvingly, as if encouraging her curiosity. Apparently, he was not at all against the fact that the girl heard the content of his conversation with the person on the other end of the line. Almost a minute passed, accompanied by measured beeps, until a young male voice came from the receiver. "Hello, Joe, why bother me at such an early hour?" spoke with some displeasure the invisible to the girl interlocutor. Delia almost couldn't help but laugh. It was already 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the clock, and this gentleman for some reason considered this time to be early. Maybe he's a lover of sleep until noon, she thought, covering her mouth with her hand. "Hello, Jaff," Jesse Joe said cheerfully. "I'm calling to find out how you are doing, what mood you are in." "Listen, what is this thing?" Not listening to his words, the interlocutor spoke with despair. "When the electricity is turned off in the morning and only turned on in the evening. I'm already tired of getting dressed in the morning by candlelight." "No idea, mate," Jordan replied calmly. "I have electricity from another substation." Delia was bored listening to them talking about electric power problems, but she understood that this was only the beginning of the conversation, and the most important thing would be said later. Intuition did not disappoint the girl. "Look, Jaff," with feigned carelessness said Jesse Joe. "Do you mind host the couple of not much star-studded folks?" "Couple," a surprised voice came from the receiver. "Are you not the only one coming to visit me?" Baby girl blushed slightly when her adult friend used the phrase "not much star-studded folks." What would happen, she thought? He considers me to be his, but at the same time he constantly makes it clear that I am not smart enough to be equal to him. However, Jesse Joe, busy talking, did not notice the thoughtful expression on Delia's face. "Yes, friend, I want to introduce you to my new neighbor, Delia, pharmaceutist's daughter." Very smart and sweet girl. At these words, he turned to the baby and was a little embarrassed when he met her gaze. "You going to come with a babby?" a voice answered thoughtfully. "What, you're afraid that the young lady will get bored and remember you as a rare bore?" chuckled Jesse Joe. "Wrong, matey. Delia is a serious girl, loves to talk about literary topics. We recently read the Bruder Strugatsky with her, and she liked it very much." "Whom?" Not understand man on the other end of the line. "Well, do you remember the book Uncle Corbel got me?" said Jesse Joe, hiding not his pride in himself and Delia. Which is in German," murmured the voice, as if only now he understood what the interlocutor was talking about. "So be cool about the boredom, Jaff," Jordan cheered up his friend. "Sit, chat, read your book, take a look. The main thing is that there is something to put on the desk." I hope you don't have any problems with this? Silence reigned on the phone. Apparently Jaff went to check if he had anything in the fridge. Delia, who had been standing behind a Jussie Joe all this time, suddenly felt very hungry because that day she ate only twice, at home in the morning and when she just came to a neighbor. In both these cases, it was limited to small, half a grapefruit and homemade shortbread, with which Uncle Joe wanted to please her, but his culinary skills did not make much impression on Baby, and in the end, Delia was still starving.